there are certain rights that human beings are entitled to, and those rights are all they need. Everything else is additional. You don't have to be wealthy not to be poor. You can be not poor if you have social justice. You have shelter, you have food, you have access to health services, and that may be all you need. A policy of hiring that requires that you need to be ready to travel 70% of your time is already a privilege policy, because it's saying that actually you don't have the nurturing role. You can be out of home for 70% of the time. Part of the reason why we have such high teenage pregnancy rates in the continent of Africa, part of the reason why we have women having their first child at 15 years is because we have refused to recognize that women need to take up the positions of leadership. It is the women who understand the consequences of not putting the right policies in place. If a woman walks in pregnant to an interview, I can guarantee you that if the men at that interview they are less likely to give her that job. Women don't need to be lifted. Women need to be given a field without barriers.
It is time to reimagine leadership. My name is Ben Owden, and I would like to welcome you to a series of conversations in partnership with Women Lift Health around how can we develop new approaches to the new challenges that leaders face in the 21st century. Greetings to you. I hope you are doing well and are having a productive and meaningful day. Welcome to another episode of the Why Lead podcast, and I'm your host, Ben Owden. And in partnership with Women Lift Health, we are bringing you a series of conversation to reimagine leadership and to talk about new approaches to new challenges within the leadership space in the healthcare sector and beyond that. And I would like to start off this conversation with a quote. There's a quote that I particularly like that says, "We need to resist the tyranny of low expectations. We need to open our eyes to the inequality that remains. We won't unlock the full potential of the workplace," and I add to that, to society, "until we see how far we are from equality." This is a quote from Sheryl Sandberg. Many of us know her. She was the COO of Facebook. We need to resist the tyranny of low expectations, and we need to see how far from equality we really are. Now, many of us see how far we are, but really do nothing. And yet there are those who see the inequality and actually pledge to do something to close that gap. And our guest today amplifies the latter. He is a passionate advocate for universal health coverage in Africa, currently a co-chair of the UHC 2030 Steering Committee, a Global World Bank and World Health Organization initiative for universal health coverage. He was issued the Moran of the Order. This was an interesting part of his profile. He was issued the Moran of the Order of the Burning Spear, a presidential commendation given to recipients on the advice on the National Honors and Awards Committee in the Office of the President. He serves on various boards in Kenya and beyond. In June 2023, he was appointed by the UN Secretary General as a member of the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement Lead Group, a global initiative dedicated to eradicating all forms of malnutrition by 2030. He has been the Global Chief Executive Officer of Amref Health Africa since June 2015. It is the largest Africa-based international health and development organization providing training and health services to over 20 million people annually in at least 35 countries in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Githinji Gitahi. Karibu.
Asante.
I would like to start this conversation with a little game. So let's say you get to play God for a day, and you're given the assignment of creating a utopia. What would be the first three things you would change?
Wow, that's heavy. I think that the first thing I would change is to provide everybody social justice. Mm-hmm. Social justice in this way that there are certain rights that human beings are entitled to. And those rights are all they need. Everything else is additional. I say that, for example, you don't have to be wealthy not to be poor. Mm. You can be not poor if you have social justice. Mm. Meaning you have shelter, you have food, you have access to health services, and that may be all you need. Mm. So access to social justice for all is one thing that I would do. Mm. The second thing I would do alongside the same is actually equality.
Mm.
Equality meaning that you achieve the same resources for all, and for those who don't have, to be fair, to bring them up to the table. And that's equity.
Mm.
The third thing I would do is balance between humans, animals, and the environment. That are actually human beings see themselves as part of the ecosystem, not as the supervisors of the ecosystem.
Mm.
Those are things I would do.
Wow. Wow, that was a very good answer. And I think I'm trying to imagine a world where that is available to everyone. I would like to live in that world. And hopefully we get closer and closer to that reality as we continue on. Now, when it comes to advancing gender equality, particularly in leadership, the role of allyship is extremely paramount. I think sometimes the fight for any form of equality or justice is usually left to the people who are seeking or asking or advocating for it. So if it's racial justice, it's usually the minority group. If it's gender equality, then it's the women who are doing this. But I think, like you're saying, going back to this sort of like utopia that you just explained, we all have to participate. We all have to be involved. And in this fight for gender equality, especially in leadership, it is not just a fight for women. I think we live in a world where we men have a lot of power, and there are so much that we can do to open doors, to advance women leadership, and especially in healthcare, where it is a very male-dominated field. And so, what are sort of the mindset shifts that men need to have to be the kind of people who embrace this idea? I think there's in one of the banners for the conference I saw, there was a very beautiful line. It's like, when women lead, better healthcare follows. How do we get to a point where, on a fundamental level, as men, we believe that? So then that idea of advancing leadership, of opening doors, of bringing women and giving them seats on the table is something that feels natural, is something that we advocate for.
Well, I think the first thing and the most important thing of allyship is awareness. That allyship is not about mentorship. Because men may have the general ownership of their privilege, and they think that they're privileged and therefore they have a role to lift women. Women don't need to be lifted. Women need to be given a field without barriers. So allyship is about first men recognizing that they actually apply privilege on women, just like white apply privilege on black, just like rich apply privilege on poor. Men apply privilege on women. This may be born out of the historical, social, cultural norms that have given men privilege. And that privilege may be reflected in, for example, the oldest thing is land ownership. Because of the norms that men are more powerful and therefore they are masculine, they need to inherit the land. And women don't inherit the land. And in a continent or in a country, in a world where land is a factor of production, as is labor and capital, then if you do not have land, even if you have labor and capital, then you can't produce. And therefore women bow down to men so that they have access to land. That's just one example of privilege. And this has been reflected in many areas, including control of capital and all these things. So the most important element or dimension of allyship is awareness that we have privilege. And I think that once you do that, then men understand that that's the first step of allyship. The reason for this privilege has also been because of a misunderstanding of the roles of women and men. And because women biologically are the ones that give birth and nurture life, men see that as the only role of women. And therefore that kind of defines the policies they put in place. And those policies become barriers to women. So this awareness of men's privilege as a start to the journey of allyship is then followed by, vulnerability. That now I realize I have privilege. So I have to be vulnerable and let go of my power so that we share it equally. And that means now you have to find out what really is it that stops us as individuals or institutions from being able to be vulnerable and hand over that power. It is because we built for years and years policies that protect our privilege. So we have then to revisit those policies. I'll give you an example. If you have, yesterday I was listening to some people and say, a policy of hiring that requires that you need to be ready to travel 70% of your time is already a privilege policy because it's saying that actually you don't have the nurturing role. You can be out of home for 70% of the time. Now, realizing as a male that you have a position to change that policy so that you allow women an equal chance to get the job without having to accept to travel 70% of their time is allyship. So I think men need first to be aware of their privilege, be ready to hand over that privilege, and in handing over that, be ready to remove barriers and to build bridges for women to cross those barriers because women don't have a problem. They don't need to be fixed. Men don't have to lift women. It is actually the men need to remove the barriers they have created to achieve equality. And that process of removing barriers is what we call equity.
Yeah. I love what you just said. And I think I can imagine it's a very hard idea to embrace. I love this quote that says, people do not avoid or reject or fear change. What people don't like is loss. When you're asking someone to change, you're technically asking them to part ways with a way of thinking, with a way of living that they have held on for a very long time. And I think going back to this sense of privilege, this privilege that we have as men is something that many hold very dear. And we have a lot of systems within our society and community that reinforce that, from religion to tribal ideologies, sometimes national ideologies that come into it, that constantly reinforce that this is not just a privilege, this is a God-given right, this is all of these things. And I think sometimes when we're called to rethink, it's a deeply personal battle that people have to, fight and get to the other side. So I guess my question is, what's at stake? Because I think sometimes when people realize that if I continue on this path, this is what's at stake, collectively as a human race, so to speak. What's at stake if some completely refuse to let go of that privilege? Because I like the approach that you said. It is more intrinsic. It is looking deep within, which means if you are able to make the transition, it's sustainable, and it will reflect in all aspects of your life, how you raise your daughters, probably, how you interact and engage within your community, how you advocate formally and informally for women within your community and beyond. So what's at stake if we completely say, nah, I'll continue on this journey that I'm on?
Yeah. You make a very important point around what do you give up. I watched a short video that said that if you're caught in a loop, either in your own human life, in your own personal life, institution, company, whatever it is, you must ask yourself, what profit is actually you're gaining from that loop that you need to give up? So if you're in a loop of alcoholism, you must ask, what's the profit that I need to give up to get out of this loop? If you're in a loop of, whatever it is. And in this particular case, we are in a loop of inequality. And you've captured it well, that we have to identify what profits do we need to give up for us to get out of the loop of inequality. And those profits are the profits we get from the privilege. Men up to now, 2024, will still insist they want their wives to play the traditional role at home, but they also want them to grow professionally. So you have to give up something. And the profit may be that when you get home, you make your own meal. Because the woman you're living with has to advance their career. It may mean that actually, if you have children at home, you take care of them as much as, your wife does. And this is not only within the home setting, even at work. The notion that certain roles can only be done by men also has to be, is that there is a profit to it, that you're trying to gather, and you have to let go of that profit and open up the space for everybody. What is at stake? What is at stake is actually development. It's development. That we know that if we don't get women on the decision-making table, if we don't remove barriers for women to get there, then we are actually going to suffer the consequences through poor development. Let me give an example. Part of the reason why we have such high teenage pregnancy rates in the continent of Africa, part of the reason why we have women having their first child at 15 years is because we have refused to recognize that women need to take up the positions of leadership, because it is the women who understand the consequences of not putting the right policies in place. I've had people come to me and say, oh, why are we only focusing on the girl child? Why not the boy child? And I've said that the choice to support women and girls is not a choice against men. It's actually a choice for men. It is that when you don't actually develop and remove the barriers for women to develop, the men also are held back in their development. We know that GDPs grow when women are given equal chances as men. We know that GDPs grow, wealth is created out of women who are empowered, educated, delay their first pregnancy, get their education, and therefore eventually, when they actually have the education and now they have the means to create wealth, they bring up better families. They bring up healthier families. So development is at risk, is at stake. Health is at stake. And that is not only for women. It is that those two are at stake for men as well. Yes.
There's an article that was captured by, a study that was captured by an article, I think yourself and Amy wrote. And in it, there was a study done by Women Lift Health with partners in North America, Europe, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and India that highlights unequal pay as one of the universal barriers impacting women's ability to advance in leadership positions in health. Women are greatly underpaid within the healthcare sector. And this is just one among many inequalities. And when I read this, it reminded me of a different study that I have come across this past year by work published by Matthias Zutter, who is a behavioral economist based in Europe. And in his study, he highlights, this is one very interesting study where they look at how men negotiate versus how women negotiate, and how it is more natural for men to have a more competitive spirit. So how they negotiate, it is much easier for a man when they go for a job interview, they can ask for a salary and then go to a different company and basically put them against each other, meaning that I am offered this much by this company, can you pay me more, right? That is something that men are much more natural to, do and approach versus women. This is what they found in this study. And so the conversation then became, okay, so which means should organizations now change even how they have conversations around negotiation to favor the natural inclination of a particular group of people to negotiate, so women don't necessarily negotiate the same way, but it feels like systems are created to favor what seems natural to men. So I guess here the question really is, when we talk about true inclusion, where we take into consideration a lot of aspects of someone's humanity, including things that maybe we can't really quite explain, but it seems the large majority of people within a particular sector of our society have those tendencies. So how much is too much, so to speak, when it comes to being truly inclusive? How much is too little and how much is too much, so to speak?
I think that this is a question that we were discussing earlier around policy level barriers.
Mm-hmm.
And the situation you've just described is actually policy level barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we are actually employing and we are remunerating, we must actually ensure that our performance appraisals, our remuneration policies are cognizant of these differences. That actually, when you have a man and a woman on the same grade, the room for negotiation is lower. It should be that based on your workload, what you achieve, your experience, and this is a grade you're in, and this is what we pay. Therefore, you reduce these differences because women are largely very empathetic, which men are not. Okay? Men have less empathy than women. And men are more likely to be selfish than women.
More
and
aggressive,
that's what more aggressive, and that's what you just described. Men and boys naturally are known to be more left brain, logical and calculative and analytical. When women are more empathetic, they are more holistic. So even when they're talking in a job, they also think about the entire environment. They're thinking about other people in the organization. So even as they're negotiating, they're thinking, how are the others? Are they okay? They're more naturalists. They're also thinking beyond themselves. Men are thinking, no, I'm thinking about myself. They're more analytical. They're likely to be more selfish. Therefore, the only way to remove these biases is actually to ensure that the policies are set with these biases in mind. And in societies where it's the same, even in hiring, that if I can ask you, if a woman walks in pregnant to an interview, I can guarantee you that if the men are there in the interview, they are less likely to give her that job because they'll say, oh, you're pregnant. You're going to go on maternity leave soon, But the man who made her pregnant may also be interviewing in the same room. But no one will see physically that he's actually part of this equation. So I think that we must set policies that remove the barriers. I was hearing a story about the former Prime Minister of New Zealand that when she was campaigning and another political party asked her, are you likely to become Prime Minister? Are you likely to get pregnant when you're Prime Minister? Can you imagine? And she said, yes, I will. And she actually did, But it's not, you need to be cognizant of these challenges and remove the barriers through policy legislation to avoid these biases.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what you said earlier, which I absolutely love, meaning the awareness of the privilege being the foundation of all of this. Because when you're aware of that, then even in that conversation, even in that negotiating room, you become aware that, okay, I have to approach this from a very different angle than I would if I was maybe negotiating with a fellow man. Now, as we're drawing near to our conversation, there's a quote that makes me think quite a bit about a number of things. It says, leadership requires disturbing people, but at the rate they can absorb. So disturb them, but maybe not too much. Strike a balance there, right? And I think sometimes the extreme version of interpreting this is saying, let's just go extremely slow. Let's not try to flip the table and ruffle the feathers. Let's just be very patient and slow. And sometimes you see this happening in some contexts, especially I think in the African continent, where some of this progress is slow because we're not trying to disturb people at the level they cannot absorb. We feel like if it's too much too soon, it will not be good. But I guess the question here is this fight for equality, especially in the leadership space and particularly in healthcare? And I think I don't know if that was just a unique situation, but when I go to the hospital sometimes and the doctor happens to be a woman, the quality of the care is on a different level. I don't know if that is universally the case or it's just for me uniquely, but I think there's a different level of nurturing and care and consideration. And like you said, this sense of empathy. And when you talk about healthcare on a global level, empathy is very important. It's not just thinking about yourself, but thinking about the entire ecosystem. And so is this fight to advance, equality, especially in leadership, in the healthcare, is this something that has to be approached with a deep sense of urgency, or is it just one of those where let's go slower, based on what people are comfortable with at the moment?
It has to be approached with a sense of urgency, and your feeling around the care experience from women is actually true. In fact, 70% of the health workforce is women because they are carers. They're carers, okay? And that goes back to the more holistic approach of women you talked about earlier. Whereas men are more inward looking, women are more ecosystem driven. They can see, because they are more aligned to feelings, to color, to actually all the senses around them, which men are not. And that gives them the caregiving ability. And that's why 70% of the health workforce is women. But then, because of the barriers that we have, barriers to do with women's, natural caregiving at the family level, those barriers come to the workplace. And therefore, the men tend to rise to lead what the women are doing, but it's the women actually providing the care. Now, there's something you talked about, leadership and the measure of how much people can take. Leadership is movement. Leadership is movement. And you can never have movement without friction. Yeah. So if you're really going to lead, because leadership is to transform, that's why it's movement. It's moving from here to there. Management is, you can leave me this setup to manage, and when you come back, you'll find it exactly as it is. But if it's leadership, I may have moved this upside down. I may have replaced the items on this because I want to transform the situation you left me in. And if leadership is movement, and you can never move without friction. If a car doesn't want friction, it can't move. It will just be in the same place. That friction must be accepted. And that friction is actually what we were talking about earlier, giving up the profits. Giving up those profits, actually having some level of discomfort that must be there. The men must feel uncomfortable about their privilege. And when they feel uncomfortable and they're aware, they must then open up the spaces to say, I am actually leading a sector that is 70% women. Am I truly representing them? Or do I want them on the table so that even if I'm the one leading, they're actually on the table to make the decisions about the healthcare system? If women were asked during COVID how to implement lockdowns at night, they would probably have thought and said, well, there could be a woman who is going to be in labor at night. And therefore, we need to ensure, even as you say, people have a curfew after 7, we must also put in place a policy to allow women in labor to transition to a facility. But because men were making these decisions, we found women stranded at home and delivering at home because the curfew installation did not consider how women in labor and labor tend to come at night were actually going to get skilled delivery. This is why we must get women on the table, and there'll be friction because men who have profits from this privilege will try and resist. And the systems must change, policies must change, legislation must change. So we cannot wait, because I've heard that at the rate we are going, it's going to take us 112 years. I don't have 112 years. I'm not sure you have 112 years.
I don't think I do.
So it's got to be urgent.
Thank you for a very thoughtful response there. Now, there's a question that we ask pretty much all of our guests on the show. The 111. What is the one book that you have read at some point? Could be a book that you read this year that you wish you had read earlier in your life. What's the one habit that you have developed over time that you wish you had developed earlier as well? And what is the one personal value that you will make sure that you hold on to it, you fight to keep it, and you will not compromise no matter the cost?
The one book that I've read that has been transformational and that I would take with me is a book called The Great Escape. Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality. It is written by an economist called Angus Deaton. This book writes from an economic point of view the value of social justice. And you can actually see clearly the linkages between discrimination and poverty. So that book is a book I would read. I think I've read it 3 times now.
Wow.
So that's the book. I would say it's actually been very transformational. No surprise that the author of this book actually won a Nobel Prize for economics.
Wow.
The one habit that I wish I started earlier, I have 2 habits to share. One is personal and my own mental health, and the other one is about leading people. And my own mental health, during COVID, I started walking 9,000 steps every day. And that has helped me because that's when I think, that's when I'm walking those 9,000 steps, and I walk an average of 9,000 steps since November 2020 to date without fail. The other habit is the habit of speaking last. That actually when you're in a place, whether it's a social setting, in a company setting, institutional, always listen and speak last. You actually tend to learn more, and it improves what you say at the end. So learn to speak last. And that means giving up your position, because if you are the chair of the meeting or the leader in the room, by speaking last, you're actually handing over your privilege to the other people to have a view and opinion that actually will eventually shape yours. The last thing is about values. The value that I will never compromise is integrity. Integrity. And integrity in the way I operate, the way I treat people. And with that integrity is also respect, it's authenticity, because that is how you build your trust. So if you don't have integrity, you don't have authenticity, because then you have to cover up things, and you're not empathetic, you cannot build trust. So that value of integrity for me is the one I hold dear.
And curious, how do you define integrity?
I define integrity very simply. Integrity is what you can do in the dark and in the light. The same consistency. Yes. What I can do in the dark, I can do in the light and not feel embarrassed. We used to define it as what you can do today. And if it is on the headlines of the newspaper tomorrow, you're not going to be embarrassed. Yeah.
Wow. Dr. Githinji, thank you so much for your time. This has been a very insightful conversation. You've given me a lot to think about, and I particularly like this very intrinsic approach that you're challenging us to have, to basically look in the mirror, and to look within ourselves and to start there. So thank you for your time, for this conversation, and to our dear listener and those who are watching, thank you. This has been the Wild Lead Podcast. I am your host, Ben Owden.